10 truly horrible WCW gimmicks that made it to television. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for daily wrestling videos. Number 10. Creative Control. Oran and Don Harris have had countless gimmicks during their careers, and most of these failed to connect with the crowd. When the duo joined WCW during the final years of the promotion's existence, WCW's bold idea was for the duo to portray a tag team known as Creative Control. Creative Control consisted of Gerald and Patrick, and the main idea behind the tag team was that they were a direct shot at Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe, who were the central figures on WWE television at the time. The duo would act as bodyguards of sorts to Vince Russo, and the group failed to get over, which didn't exactly come as a surprise to anyone still watching WCW at the time. This was during the time period in which WCW, specifically Vince Russo, was utterly obsessed with breaking the fourth wall and allowing the fans to know that they were watching a fake scripted show. When WCW was purchased by WWE in 2001, the Harris brothers weren't hired by WWE, and after their recent work in WCW, this was probably the right call. Number 9. Oklahoma. Pro wrestling parodies have been a thing for decades, yet when these are delivered, they should always be tasteful and respect the legitimacy and success of that respective character. Unfortunately, Vince Russo never got this memo, and in 1999 he introduced the world to Oklahoma. This dreadful character was portrayed by former WWE writer Ed Ferrara, and the entire idea behind the character was just to mock and belittle Jim Ross for his Bell's palsy. JR is well established for being one of the most respected and well-liked names in pro wrestling, so WCW mocking him in such a disgusting manner angered fans as well as other wrestling personalities. The out-of-touch Russo devoted so much time and effort into getting this character over that he would even book Oklahoma to win the Cruiserweight title. Number 8. The Renegade. In 1995, WCW would heavily tease that the Ultimate Warrior had signed for the company. Hulk Hogan would promote an Ultimate surprise debut at the Uncensored pay-per-view, and WCW would even show a silhouette of a man with long hair and tassels tied to his arms, and it seemed like a given that the Warrior was coming into the promotion. However, this turned out to be a major swerve, as WCW would debut a wrestler known as the Renegade, who was basically a wrestler doing a cheap and lazy Warrior impression. The gimmick was dead on arrival, yet WCW persisted with it. That was until the lack of crowd reaction was too noticeable to ignore. Eric Bischoff would discuss the cheap gimmick on his podcast, and this is what the former WCW president had to say. Quite obvious that Renegade was, as you put it, the cosplay Ultimate Warrior. He was that character that, I think from Hulk's point of view, he hoped that the audience could get behind. You can't recreate something that was, no matter how popular it was for how long of a period of time or how short of a period of time. You can't recreate it with a lesser than character. You could dress it up the same, you could have the similar music, you could have a similar finish. You can do all the things that you can try to do to recreate lightning in the bottle, but you won't. You won't be able to. It'll always be perceived as less than, simply because it's not original. Number 7. Asia. The WCW loved to copy anything WWE did in the late 90s, and they believed that they could have had their own version of Chyna on the show. WCW would debut a wrestler known as Asia. She would be booked in a manner that was similar to Chyna, yet she didn't have the star power or aura that the late great former Intercontinental Champion did. WCW would book her to be the bodyguard for the Revolution stable, yet she had zero chemistry with any of the members, and the fans were just collectively wondering when WCW were going to begin to implement their own unique ideas. WCW would often remind fans on commentary that Asia was bigger than Chyna, and this was incredibly forced and did nothing to make fans invest in the character. WCW were failing to understand that their fans wanted new, exciting ideas, and delivering cheap parodies of legendary names from the WWE was not going to save the company. Number 6. Big T. At one stage, it looked set that Ahmed Johnson was set to be a future world champion in the WWE. However, Johnson wasn't exactly Mr. Popular backstage, and when he left WWE in '98, it was an expectation that he wouldn't be welcomed back with open arms. Johnson would sign with WCW in late '99, and he would look considerably different than when he appeared on WWE TV. Johnson would now be known as Big T, and he would join forces with Stevie Ray. This character was atrocious and lacked any substance or meaning. WCW would try to explain that Johnson was the former friend of Booker T and Ray, but that was mysteriously never mentioned until 1999. They had signed him just because he was a former WWE name, and literally that was it. His in-ring work had also dramatically regressed, and he was eventually released from his contract due to his weight issues. Number 5. West Hollywood Blondes. LGBT+ characters have always been present in pro wrestling, yet when WCW tried to introduce a homosexual tag team in the 90s, their presentation was so bad and offensive that WCW were forced to cancel their creative plans. The West Hollywood Blondes consisted of Lenny Lane and Lodi, and they were a gay Californian duo with pink trunks and flashy haircuts, and it was later revealed that the two were brothers. The name was a reference to the Hollywood Blondes, a legendary tag team that consisted of Stone Cold Steve Austin and Brian Pillman. The depiction of homosexuality was so offensive that Glad wrote a letter to the Turner Network, and the letter contained key points such as, the character Lenny is presented with the intention to incite the crowd to the most base homophobic behavior. The audience's reaction to Lenny and Lodi being physically attacked by other wrestlers gives permission to viewers to do harm to gay people in a very literal way, and it's appalling. Number 4. The Booty Man. Brutus Beefcake was an outstanding gimmick, and it managed to get incredibly over. One of the reasons why the gimmick worked so well was that it was insanely unique for the respective time period, and fans always loved uniqueness in pro wrestling. Unfortunately, most of Ed Leslie's other gimmicks were atrociously executed. One of his gimmicks in WCW saw him become the Booty Man. The gimmick involved him becoming infatuated with his own backside, and it was fun for about 30 seconds before it became incredibly stale. Fans often draw comparisons to the Booty Man and the Mr. Ass gimmick that WWE would later debut. The Mr. Ass persona came at a time where fans were crying out for raunchy gimmicks, and the Mr. Ass gimmick provided that, as well as a solid in-ring output. Eric Bischoff had a truthful yet brutal take as to why the character failed to get over in WCW on his podcast, and this is what he had to say. I think Brutus Beefcake in WWE, then WWF, worked because that product was produced and targeted to teens and preteens. All of the characters were very animated. There were human cartoons, and Brutus the Barber Beefcake, the character, and Leslie the performer was probably almost perfect for that era and that character, being targeted towards that audience. Now we're in a different era in terms of television. He was great at being the barber, but he didn't have the talent or the instinct to adapt and to embrace a character that would appeal to the 18 to 49-year-old demographic. It was classic square peg round hole, and it didn't work, and we were forced. Well, he's the Brutus that he was the Booty Man, and then he was the Disciple, and then he was whatever the hell he was. All of that was a reflection on the fact that we couldn't find anything to make this guy work. Number 3. The Yeti. Supernatural or horror gimmicks in pro wrestling are extremely hard to pull off well. For every Undertaker or Kane, there's been a Kevin Thorne or ECW Zombie, and WCW always struggled to present a supernatural character that had any purpose. In 1995, Ron Reese played the character of the Yeti, and the Yeti was in essence a mummy and was involved in a bizarre gimmick where he performed a double bear hug alongside the giant on Hulk Hogan. The gimmick looked unbelievably bad, and it was truly amateur hour for WCW, as there was no way that they thought this gimmick was going to be well received. WCW wanted to give the impression that the Yeti was taller than the giant, aka the Big Show, so they made Reese have lifts in his boots, and they purposely had the bandages wrapped above his normal head height. Unfortunately, this was the only thought anyone in the company put into the gimmick. The Yeti would eventually go from a mummy to a ninja, and of course, this was so Reese could actually wrestle. Yet this sudden change was never addressed to the fans, so there was some confusion as to whether this was the same character at all. Number 2. Seven. Dustin Rhodes deserves all the credit in the world for making the Goldust character work. The Goldust character pushed boundaries, yet it was done in such a way which resulted in the character getting over, and the character helped make Rhodes a certified legend within the wrestling industry. When Rhodes left WWE for WCW in '99, there was hope that Rhodes could have similar success with a new character known as Seven. The character would appear in vignettes where Rhodes would have new face paint, and he would be standing outside a child's bedroom window. This was incredibly ominous, and it was only a matter of time before WCW received complaints. The character was dropped after Turner standards and practices highlighted concerns that Rhodes' new persona could be interpreted as a child abductor. WCW would turn this into a work shoot when Rhodes would remove the costume on WCW TV and bury unrealistic gimmicks that were present in wrestling. It was certainly a bizarre end to a controversial gimmick. And number 1, the Powers That Be. WCW took the prize for the Wrestling Observer's Worst Gimmick of the Year for 1999, and the gimmick responsible was the dire Powers That Be character. When Vince Russo came on board as head writer, nobody was expecting Russo to be a character on TV, yet Russo ended up being a central figure on the show, and he was the one behind the mysterious Powers That Be that would be referenced across WCW programming. The Powers That Be were basically the individual or individuals who were running the show, and it was eventually revealed to be Russo, which led to a ton of criticism. There was not a single WCW fan crying out for Russo to be on screen, and the more this character developed, the worse it became. Russo would soon begin to wrestle in featured matches, and in one of the worst moments in WCW history, he would win the WCW World title, which annihilated the credibility of the once prestigious title. But there you have it, folks, 10 truly horrible WCW gimmicks that made it to television. Be sure to leave your comments down below, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling content.